The Thessaly was bleeding atmosphere from her starboard hull when the first boarding clamps hit, and Marin Calloway felt the shudder through the soles of her boots like a second heartbeat. She was kneeling beside a ruptured conduit on deck 4, her hands slick with coolant, when the ship's emergency lighting kicked in and turned everything the color of old blood. The klaxon screamed 3 times and then went dead. That was the part that scared her, not the noise, but the silence after. It meant someone had cut the alarm from outside. Someone who didn't want the Thessaly calling for help. "All hands," Captain Rourke's voice crackled over the failing intercom, already resigned, already knowing. "We are being boarded. Repeat, we are being boarded. All non-combat personnel to the cargo bay. Do not resist." Marin wiped coolant on her coveralls, stood, and walked toward the cargo bay with the rest of the crew. She did not hurry. She kept her breathing slow and even in her hands where anyone could see them. Around her, the other 23 crew members were doing the math, an unarmed freight hauler, 3 days out from the Velos shipping lane, with no escort and a distress beacon that had just been jammed. The math was bad. She had known it would be. The first Vakari she saw came through the port airlock in a low crouch, weapon first, moving with the segmented grace of something that had too many joints. Its exoskeleton was the mottled gray-green of deep ocean stone, and its face, if you could call it a face, was a flat plate of chitin with 4 horizontally slit eyes that tracked independently. Each eye had its own lid, and they blinked in sequence, left to right, like a thought being processed across a biological circuit board. The Vakari wore no uniform. Its armor was scarification, chemical burns etched into its own shell in patterns that marked rank and kill count and territorial claim. This one's chest was covered in them. More followed. 8, 12, 16. They moved through the corridors of the Thessaly like water through cracks, flowing around corners, filling doorways, their weapons trained on everything warm. Their language was a series of clicks and subsonic pulses that Marin could feel in her teeth, a bass thrum that bypassed her eardrums entirely and resonated in the small bones of her inner ear, making her jaw ache. She'd spent 3 years learning to decode those patterns. She could parse about 70% of what they said if they spoke slowly. They were not speaking slowly now. The smell hit next. Every species has one, and the Vakari smelled like hot copper and wet stone, a mineral sharpness that coated the inside of your nose and stayed there. The Thessaly's air recyclers would carry that scent for weeks after this was over, long after the last alien boot had left the deck. Marin breathed through her mouth and filed the information away the way she filed everything, automatically, without judgment, cataloged for later use. Around her, the crew was being herded. Tamaz, the big Chilean loadmaster who could bench press a cargo dolly, had his hands on his head and his eyes on the floor. Dr. Liang, the ship's medic, was trying to tend to a gash on a crewman's arm and being shoved away by a Vakari rifle, but every time she reached for her kit. Young Priya, 24, first deep space tour, eyes wide enough to show white all the way around, was pressed against the bulkhead with her hands flat against the metal, breathing in short, panicked bursts that fogged the wall in front of her face. Marin caught her eye and gave her the smallest nod. Hold on. Just hold on. The last one through the airlock was the one she'd been waiting for. Vas Ketharin was taller than the others by a full head. His exoskeleton was darker, almost black, and the scarification on his chest formed a single massive glyph that Marin knew translated roughly to the one who takes what is owed. He carried no weapon. He didn't need one. His forelimbs ended in manipulating claws that could crack pressure-rated hull plating, and his mandibles, 4 interlocking blades around a mouth that had no lips, were stained the faint purple of old blood from a species that wasn't his own. He walked upright like a human parody, his secondary arms folded against his thorax, and his 4 eyes scanned the gathered crew of the Thessaly with the detached efficiency of a butcher counting livestock. His gaze passed over Marin without stopping. "Good. Captain Rourke stepped forward. He was 63, gray-haired, built like a man who'd spent his whole life in 1G corridors, and he held himself with the kind of rigid dignity that came from knowing he was going to die, but wanting to do it standing up. "I am Captain David Rourke of the Terran trade vessel Thessaly, registry number." Vos Ketharin backhanded him across the face. The blow was casual, almost lazy, but it sent Rourke spinning into the bulkhead with a sound like a sack of wet sand hitting concrete. The captain slid to the deck, blood pouring from a gash above his left eye, and two crew members moved to help him before a Vicari rifle swung toward them and they froze. "There is no negotiation." Voss's voice was rendered through a translation device clipped to his thorax, a small black box that turned subsonic clicks into flat, effectless English. "Your ship belongs to the Ketharin Syndicate now. Your cargo belongs to us. You belong to us. Tell me where your weapons locker is, and I will let the first 5 of you choose which holding pen you die in." No one spoke. Rourke was trying to stand. Blood was running into his left eye and he kept blinking it away, his hands shaking against the deck plating. "Captain," Marin's voice was calm and clear and exactly loud enough. She stepped forward from the second row of kneeling crew members, hands raised, palms open. "He's asking about the weapons locker. Deck 2, Section 7. Access code is the captain's biometric plus a 6-digit rolling cipher. I can walk them through it." Every human eye in the room turned to her with varying shades of disbelief and contempt. Rourke looked up from the deck, blood in his teeth, and the look on his face was the worst thing Marin had seen in 11 years of field work. Not because it was angry, because it was heartbroken. He thought she was a coward. She held his gaze and said nothing. Vos Ketharin's 4 eyes focused on her simultaneously for the first time. That was how you knew a Vicari was truly paying attention, when all 4 locked onto the same target, collapsing their panoramic vision into a single point of predatory focus. "You," he said, "what is your function?" "Communications and systems technician. I keep the ship's networks running, maintain the transponder relays, handle encrypted traffic." She paused, let a beat pass. "I also know the override codes for every locked system on this vessel." The silence that followed was the Vicari equivalent of a smile. Voss tilted his head, a gesture that in his species meant reassessment, the predator noticing that the prey might be useful enough to keep breathing. "Show my technicians the weapons locker," he said. "Then you will unlock the cargo manifests." "All of them?" "Yes, sir." She walked past Rourke without looking down. She could feel his eyes on her back like a handprint. Behind her, she heard one of the younger crew members, Priya, the navigator, whisper the word traitor with enough venom to strip paint. Marin kept walking. The Vicari technician assigned to shadow her was younger than the others, its scarification sparse and shallow, a junior, eager to prove itself. It followed her through the corridors of the Thessaly with its weapon half raised, clicking rapidly in what Marin's trained ear recognized as nervous excitement. She led it to the weapons locker on Deck 2. Keyed in the override she'd memorized 6 months ago when she first came aboard, and stepped back as the door slid open to reveal the Thessaly's pathetic armament. 4 sidearms, 2 stun batons, and a flare launcher. The technician clicked something that translated roughly to "This is all." "We're a cargo ship," Marin said, "not a warship." The technician swept the weapons into a carry sack and jerked its head toward the corridor. "More." She took them to the cargo manifests next. The Thessaly was hauling 300 tons of refined lithium compounds, 40 tons of medical-grade polymers, and buried in Container 17, unlisted on the official manifest, 12 crates of quantum-encrypted communication relays destined for a Terran military outpost on the far side of the Velo's reach. That was the real cargo. That was why the Thessaly had been targeted. Marin unlocked the manifest terminal, pulled up the full inventory including the hidden crates, and let the technician scan everything with its datapad. She answered every question. She volunteered information before it was asked. She was helpful and cooperative and transparently afraid, and when the technician reported back to Vas Ketharin, she could hear the clicks that meant the human female is compliant. She may be useful. Useful, that was the word she needed. Over the next 6 hours, the Vicari stripped the Thessaly with methodical precision. They moved the crew into the cargo bay and sealed it, leaving 4 armed guards at the door. They gutted the engine room, pulled the FTL drive's control matrix, and rerouted navigation to their own boarding vessel, a sleek, angular predator ship called the Rithkai that was clamped to the Thessaly's hull like a parasite. They cataloged every piece of cargo, tested samples, and transmitted encrypted inventory data back to wherever the Ketharin Syndicate kept its records. Marin was kept separate from the crew. She was given a chair in the ship's small mess hall, a glass of water, and the company of 2 rotating guards while Vas Ketharin's senior lieutenants came and went, asking her questions about the ship systems. She answered everything. She drew diagrams. She explained the ventilation system, the water recycling plant, the backup power grid, the communication array. Especially the communication array. "Your long-range transmitter," said the lieutenant called Tesh. Its voice through the translator was higher pitched than Vas's, almost melodic. "It is military grade." "Why does a cargo ship carry military communications?" Marin didn't hesitate. "Because we're hauling military cargo. Container 17. The comm relays. Our contract requires us to maintain encrypted contact with Terran Naval Command in case of this." She gestured vaguely at the armed guards, the sealed doors, the general state of being captured by aliens. Standard protocol for sensitive shipments. Tesh clicked rapidly, consulting its own datapad. "Can you access the encrypted channels?" "I can access anything on the ship. That's my job." Tesh left. 20 minutes later, Vas Ketharin came. He folded himself into the chair across from Marin, with the deliberate care of a large predator, making itself comfortable in a small space. His secondary arms remained folded against his thorax. His primary claws rested on the table, tips scarring the surface. His 4 eyes watched her, 2 on her face, 2 tracking her hands. "You are very cooperative," he said. "I'm very alive," Marin replied. "I'd like to stay that way." "Your captain would rather die with his dignity." "My captain is 63 years old and has spent 40 years hauling freight between systems that no one cares about. Dignity is about all he has left. Me, I'm 31. I have things I'd still like to do." Vas made a sound that the translator rendered as a short burst of static, laughter, or something adjacent to it. "Humans fascinate me," he said. "You are the only species in this quadrant that will betray your own kind to survive. The Ilian would rather die. The Toresh form suicide pacts. Even the Makari, who have no concept of individual identity, will destroy themselves rather than let their swarm be used. But humans," he leaned forward, "humans will always find a way to live, even if it means crawling." "You say that like it's a weakness." "It is. Predictable weakness is the most useful kind." Marin took a sip of water. Her hand was steady. "You want me to open the encrypted military channels so you can monitor Terran naval communications. You want to know when and where rescue ships are coming so you can be long gone before they arrive. And you want me to help you crack the quantum encryption on those comm relays in Container 17, because they're worth 10 times more intact than scrapped." All 4 of Vas's eyes locked onto her face, the focused stare, full predatory attention. "You presume to know what I want." "I presume to be useful enough that you'll keep me breathing while I do it." He regarded her for a long time. The mess hall hummed with the Thessaly's laboring life support, the air recyclers working overtime to compensate for the hull breach the Vicari had punched through during boarding. Somewhere deep in the ship, metal groaned against metal. "Begin with the military channels," Voss said. "If you try to send a distress signal, I will kill 3 of your crew members. Then I will ask you to continue." "Understood." He left. Marin finished her water. Then she got to work. The Thessaly's communication array was a hybrid system, civilian-grade long-range transmitter, with a military-grade encrypted overlay that had been installed specifically for this mission. Marin knew its architecture the way a surgeon knows the human body because she had designed it. Not the hardware, the protocols. The encryption layers, the handshake sequences, the emergency broadcast algorithms. She had written them herself, 3 years ago, in a cramped office in the basement of the Terran Intelligence Directorate's headquarters on Meridian Station. She sat at the comm terminal in the Thessaly's bridge, flanked by 2 Vakari guards and watched by a remote surveillance unit that Voss had installed. She powered up the array, ran the diagnostic sequence, and began opening the encrypted channels one by one. She worked slowly, explaining each step to the guards as if they could understand the technical details, narrating her process in a calm, professional voice that the surveillance unit faithfully recorded and transmitted to Voss's command post on the Rithkai. What she did not narrate was the secondary process she was running underneath the first. While her fingers moved across the visible interface, unlocking military frequencies and displaying intercepted chatter for the Vakari to analyze, a deeper layer of code was waking up in the Thessaly's communication backbone. A dormant program she had planted during her first week aboard, 6 months ago, disguised as a routine diagnostic subroutine. The program did 3 things. First, it began recording every transmission the Vakari sent or received through their own ship's communication system, which was now networked with the Thessaly's through the boarding clamps. Second, it started a slow, methodical scan of the Rithkai's data archives, pulling files through the shared network connection in packets small enough to look like background noise. Third, and this was the part that required Marin to keep her breathing perfectly steady, it began rewriting the Thessaly's emergency beacon firmware. The beacon was currently jammed. The Vakari had deployed a signal suppressor that blanketed all standard distress frequencies, but Marin's program wasn't going to use a standard frequency. It was going to pulse a compressed data burst through the ship's navigational deflector array on a frequency that the Vakari's equipment wasn't designed to detect, because it wasn't a communication frequency at all. It was a harmonic resonance in the deflector's magnetic coils, a signal that would propagate through subspace like a whale song through deep water, carrying a single repeating message to anyone with the ears to hear it. Not a distress call, something better. An intelligence package. Marin worked through the night. The Vakari ship time was different from human standard. Their circadian rhythm ran on a 20-hour cycle, and the guards rotated every 5 hours. She ate when they gave her food, a nutrient paste that tasted like wet cardboard and smelled faintly of ammonia. She drank water from a sealed container that she suspected had been tested for toxins before being handed to her. She used the head under armed escort, the guard standing outside with its weapon drawn, and she washed her face with cold water and looked at herself in the mirror and saw nothing unusual. Just a woman, just a technician doing her job. The hours had a rhythm to them: type, decode, route, skim. Every 30 minutes she would pause, stretch her shoulders, and make a quiet comment to the guard about the progress she was making, feeding the surveillance unit a steady stream of innocent narration, while beneath the visible surface, her dormant program chewed through the Rithkai's firewalls like a worm through soft wood. The Vakari encrypted their archives with pride and sophistication, and under normal circumstances, it would have taken a full intelligence team months to crack them. But Marin wasn't cracking them from outside. She was inside the network, invited in through the boarding clamps, and the Vakari security architecture, built to repel external intrusion, had almost no defenses against a threat that was already sitting at a terminal with authorized access. It was, Marin reflected, a lot like their approach to humans in general. All their defenses pointed outward. They had never considered the possibility that something small and soft might already be inside the walls. At one point, around 300 hours, one of the files she pulled made her stop typing. Her hands hovered over the keys for 3 full seconds, an eternity in her line of work. The file was a passenger manifest from a Terran liner called the Aventine, which had been raided by the Ketharan Syndicate 9 months ago. 11 dead, 43 taken for the slave markets. The manifest listed names, ages, species. There were children on it. Human children, aged 4 to 11, with destinations listed as family reunions and holiday visits and school transfers. Ordinary lives interrupted by something monstrous. Marin read the names. She memorized them. Then she closed the file and kept working. By the time the Thessaly's chronometer read 400 hours, she had opened all 12 military channels, provided the Vekari with a real-time feed of Terran naval traffic in the sector, and confirmed that no rescue vessels were en route. The nearest Terran warship was the destroyer Kincaid, currently 48 hours away and moving in the wrong direction. Vas Ketharan received this information with what Marin interpreted as satisfaction, a slow, sequential blink of his 4 eyes, left to right, like a thought being filed away. She had also, in those same hours, pulled 4.7 terabytes of data from the Rithgai's archives. The data told a story that Marin already knew the outline of, but had never been able to prove. The Ketharan Syndicate, Voss's pirate clan, one of the most feared raider groups in the Outer Territories, had been receiving navigational intelligence from the Ilian Concordance. The Ilian, the same species that the Vekari had been locked in a territorial war with for 3 decades. The same species whose colony worlds the Ketharan Syndicate had raided 11 times in the past 4 years, killing thousands. The Ilian were feeding shipping lane data to their own enemy, and in return, the Ketharan Syndicate was targeting specific Terran vessels carrying cargo that the Ilian wanted kept out of human military hands. The scope of it was staggering. Marin scrolled through communication logs, financial records, tactical briefings. She found evidence of at least 47 coordinated raids over 3 years, each one targeting a specific Terran shipment that the Ilian had identified as strategically important. The Ilian didn't care about the cargo itself. They cared about preventing humans from receiving it. Weapons components, communication infrastructure, medical technology that could sustain human settlements in contested territory. Every piece of hardware that might help humanity expand into regions of space that the Ilian considered their sphere of influence. And the Vekari, Voss's people, were the knife. They did the killing and the taking and the destroying, and they thought they were doing it for profit, and they were. But the hand that pointed the knife was Ilian. The victims were human, and the 30-year war between the Vekari and the Ilian, the war that had defined an entire generation of Vekari culture, the war that had turned scarification into a language of sacrifice and honor, was, at least in part, a performance. A stage play with real blood, enacted for the benefit of 2 audiences. The Vekari clans who believed they were fighting their mortal enemy, and the galactic community who would never suspect that the 2 warring species were quietly cooperating to suppress a third. It was a betrayal so baroque, so layered in mutual exploitation, that only truly alien minds could have conceived of it. The Ilian used the Vekari to weaken human military logistics. The Vekari used the Ilian's intelligence to pick easy targets. Both species maintained the fiction of being enemies while quietly cooperating to suppress a third species, humanity, that neither of them wanted to see grow any stronger. Marin had suspected this for 2 years. That suspicion was the reason she was here, on this ship, in this chair, with coolant still dried on her knuckles and the taste of ammonia nutrient paste in her mouth. She was not a communications technician. She was a deep-cover operative for the Terran Intelligence Directorate, and she had spent 6 months aboard the Thessaly waiting for exactly this, for the Ketharan Syndicate to capture exactly this ship. The Thessaly had been bait. The crew didn't know. Captain Rourke didn't know. The shipping company didn't know. Only 4 people in the entire Terran Intelligence Directorate knew, and one of them was Marin, and she was the one sitting in the trap. At 600 hours, she completed the beacon modification. The navigational deflector pulsed once, a tiny fluctuation that the Vekari sensors registered as thermal noise, and a compressed intelligence package containing every file she'd pulled from the Rithkai's archives began propagating through subspace at the speed of thought. Now came the hard part. Marin waited until the guard rotation at 700 hours. She waited until the new guards had settled into the bored complacency of their watch, the particular kind of complacency that comes from guarding a cooperative prisoner who has done nothing but type and narrate and drink water for 12 straight hours. She had been building this complacency deliberately, feeding it with every helpful answer, every volunteered piece of information, every transparent display of fear. Humans called it lulling. Vekari didn't have a word for it because they'd never needed one. No species had ever tried it on them successfully before. Then she accessed the Thessaly's internal sensor grid, a system the Vekari had left intact because they needed it to monitor atmospheric conditions throughout the ship, and she triggered a cascading series of false readings. Deck 3, atmosphere breach detected. Deck 5, thermal anomaly in the reactor housing. Deck 1, unauthorized access at the port airlock. The false readings were designed to escalate in a specific sequence that mimicked a real emergency cascade, the kind that happens when a hull breach destabilizes adjacent systems. Each reading was individually plausible, and together they painted a picture of a ship that was starting to fall apart in ways that required immediate dispersed attention. The Vekari couldn't afford to ignore any of them because a real atmospheric breach on a ship they planned to keep and sell would cost them millions. The alarms didn't sound. She'd made sure of that. The alarm system had been one of the first things the Vekari had disabled. But the sensor data fed directly to the Vekari's tactical network, and within 60 seconds, the guards on the bridge were clicking rapidly into their communicators, and 2 of the 4 guards in the cargo bay were being redeployed to investigate. In the cargo bay, 24 humans were locked behind a sealed bulkhead, with 2 remaining guards instead of 4. On the bridge, Marin was alone with 2 guards who were both distracted by their communicators. She stood up from the comm terminal. "I need to use the head," she said. The nearest guard glanced at her, clicked an affirmative, and went back to its communicator. Marin walked to the bridge's secondary access corridor, turned left toward the head, and kept walking. Past the head, past the emergency equipment locker, past the junction where Corridor B7 met the main spine of the ship. She walked with the unhurried pace of a woman who knew exactly where every guard was, and exactly how long she had before anyone noticed she was gone. 90 seconds. That was how long the false sensor readings would keep them busy. She'd calculated it based on Vekari response protocols, which she'd memorized from their own tactical manuals she'd found in the Rithkai's archives. She reached Deck 2 in 40 seconds. The corridor was empty. The Vekari had pulled their patrols to investigate the false readings, and the ship's internal surveillance was still running through the Thessaly's network, which Marin had been quietly degrading for the past 6 hours, introducing microdelays, corrupting timestamps, creating blind spots that looked like equipment malfunction. She stopped at a maintenance panel in the corridor wall, popped it open with the multi-tool she'd palmed from the bridge's emergency kit, and reached inside. Behind the panel was a junction box for the ship's secondary power grid. Behind the junction box, sealed in a vacuum-wrapped package that she'd placed there on her 3rd day aboard, was a Terran Intelligence Directorate field kit, a datapad with a hardened encryption suite, a compact EMP emitter with a 2-meter effective radius, and a sidearm. She took the datapad, She left the EMP and the sidearm where they were. Then she went to find Vas Ketharin. The Rithkai was connected to the Thessaly through 3 boarding clamps and an umbilical corridor that the Vekari had pressurized for easy movement between ships. Marin walked through the umbilical with her hands visible, the datapad tucked into the waistband of her coveralls under her jacket. The umbilical was Vekari-made, a flexible tube of layered composites that flexed slightly with each step, giving the unsettling sensation of walking on something alive. The walls were translucent enough to let in the faint glow of starlight, and through the membrane she could see the junction where the 2 ships met. Human steel and Vekari composite, bolted together by force, 2 incompatible architectures held in an embrace that neither had chosen. The Vekari guard at the Rithkai's airlock let her through without question. She'd been flagged as a cooperative asset in their system, cleared for supervised movement. The fact that she didn't currently have a supervisor was, apparently, not the kind of discrepancy their protocols caught. Human systems would have caught it. But human systems were designed by humans, who understood that humans lie. The Rithkai was smaller than the Thessaly but denser, every surface covered in the angular, overlapping geometry that the Vekari used instead of aesthetic decoration. It served a function, Marin knew. The overlapping plates were structural, distributing impact force across the hull the way their own exoskeletons distributed blows across their bodies. The ship was built in the image of its creators, the way all ships are, and walking through it felt like walking through the inside of an enormous Vekari. The corridors were narrower, the ceilings lower, the lighting a dim amber that made Marin's skin look jaundiced. The air was thicker here, more humid, and it carried that copper and stone smell concentrated to the point where she could taste it on the back of her tongue. She passed 2 Vekari crew members in a corridor junction. They glanced at her and looked away, the human asset, the compliant one, moving through the ship on business that wasn't their concern. She kept her body language small and unthreatening, shoulders slightly rounded, gaze slightly lowered, moving the way a crew member moves through a captain's ship, with purpose but without ownership. She navigated by memory. She'd mapped the ship's layout from the architectural files in its own archives, and she found Vas Ketharin's command quarters in under 2 minutes. The door was sealed. She knocked. There was a long pause. Then Vas's voice, flat through the translator, "Who?" "Your cooperative human." Another pause. The door opened. Vas Ketharin was standing in the center of his quarters, his primary arms at his sides, his secondary arms unfolded for the first time Marin had seen, a sign of either comfort or combat readiness. The room was spare, a sleeping platform built for a body with too many joints, a command terminal embedded in the wall, and a single viewport that looked out on the stars. The Thessaly hung in the viewport's frame like a wounded animal, its hull scarred and venting frost into the vacuum. "You left your guards," Vas said. "They were busy. If you are here to beg for your crew's lives, the answer is the same. They will be sold at the Drikath market, alive if they cooperate, in pieces if they do not." Marin stepped into the room. The door closed behind her. She could feel Vas's attention like a physical weight, all 4 eyes locked on her, the focused stare, the full predatory assessment. She was alone with a being that could kill her with one casual swipe of a forelimb in his own ship, with no weapon and no backup and no plan that any sane person would call a plan. She smiled, just a small one, just the corners of her mouth turning up, the way her mother used to smile when she was about to say something that would change the shape of a conversation forever. "I'm not here to beg," Marin said. "I'm here to make a friend." Vas's mandibles twitched, the Vekari equivalent of a frown. "Explain." "My name isn't Marin Calloway." "Well, it is, that's my real name, but I'm not a communications technician. I'm an intelligence operative for the Terran government. I've been aboard the Thessaly for 6 months, waiting for you to capture it." The silence that followed was not the thoughtful silence of a Vekari reassessing. It was the silence of a predator deciding whether to strike. Voss's primary claws flexed, and Marin heard the faint scrape of chitin against chitin. "You are lying," he said. "A tactic. You want to make yourself seem more valuable than you are." "Possibly. Or possibly I'm about to show you something that will ruin your life, and I wanted you to understand who was doing it before I did it." She pulled the datapad from her waistband. Voss's body tensed, every joint locked, every muscle coiled, but when he saw it was a datapad and not a weapon he held. Barely. His secondary arms were fully extended now, their smaller claws opening and closing in rhythmic agitation. Marin turned the datapad toward him and activated the display. The first file was a communication log between Voss Ketharin and an Ilian diplomatic attaché named Sarenvo. The log showed 17 encrypted exchanges over the past 8 months, each one containing navigational data for specific Terran shipping routes that the Ketharin syndicate had subsequently raided. The second file was a financial ledger showing payments from the Ilian Concordance to a series of blind accounts that traced back to the Ketharin syndicate's operational fund. The payments totaled the equivalent of 40 million Terran credits over 3 years. The third file was a holographic recording, pulled from the Rithkai's own surveillance system, of Voss Ketharin meeting face-to-face with Sarenvo in the cargo bay of a neutral station, exchanging data crystals with the species that his own people believed was their mortal enemy. Voss stared at the display. His 4 eyes moved independently, scanning different parts of the data, and for the first time since Marin had seen him, his body was completely still. Not the stillness of a predator about to strike. The stillness of a creature that had just realized the ground under its feet was not ground at all, but the surface of something much deeper and much more dangerous. "Where," he said very quietly, "did you get this?" "From your own ship's archives, while I was helpfully unlocking your military channels." "That is impossible. Our encryption is based on a rotating prime factorization algorithm that your species has been using for 60 years without significant modification. We cracked it 40 years ago. We just never had a reason to tell you." Voss's mandibles opened and closed around nothing. The translation device rendered it as a sound like grinding stone. "Now," Marin said, "let me tell you what happens next. In about 3 hours, a compressed intelligence package containing everything on this datapad, plus another 4 terabytes of operational data from your archives, is going to arrive at Terran Intelligence Headquarters. They will verify it, and within 24 hours, they will distribute it to every species in this quadrant. The Ilian Concordance will face sanctions from the Galactic Trade Assembly for covert military cooperation with a designated pirate organization. And the Vakari territorial clans, the ones who have been fighting and dying in a war against the Ilian for 30 years, will learn that the Ketharin syndicate has been secretly working with the enemy the whole time." She let that sink in. She watched all 4 of Voss's eyes process it, watched the implications cascade through a mind that was alien but not stupid, not even slightly stupid. "Your own people will come for you," she said. "The territorial clans. They will hunt the Ketharin syndicate to extinction. Not because of the piracy, they don't care about that. Because you cooperated with the Ilian. Because you shook hands with the enemy while your own species bled." Voss's voice, when it came, was stripped of the translator's usual flat affect. Something raw and subsonic bled through, a vibration that Marin felt in her sternum. "You would destroy my clan." I already have the means. The transmission is already sent, you can't stop it." She paused and tilted her head, a deliberately human gesture, the kind of small social signal that Vakari found deeply unsettling because they couldn't parse it. "But I'm not going to." His eyes narrowed, all 4 of them. "Why?" "Because killing you would be easy, and easy solutions don't last. Your syndicate operates in a region of space that my government needs stable. If the territorial clans tear you apart, the power vacuum fills with something worse. We've modeled it. 6 different scenarios, all bad. She sat on the edge of his sleeping platform. The surface was hard and slightly warm, designed for a body with a different relationship to comfort. She crossed her legs and rested the data pad on her knee, casual and calm, the way you might sit across from a colleague in a break room. Here's what I want instead. The intelligence package I sent contains everything, but it's encrypted with a Terran intelligence cipher. My superiors won't release it without my authorization code. I am the lock and the key. If I tell them to sit on it, they sit on it. If I tell them to release it, every clan in Vekari space knows your secret by tomorrow. Voss was very still. His secondary arms had retracted against his thorax again, a defensive posture Marin knew, protective, the gesture of a Vekari that felt cornered. What do you want? Marin smiled again, the same small smile, the one her mother used. The most powerful pirate captain in the outer territories. I've always wanted a friend like that. The sound Voss made was not translatable. It was low and long, and it resonated in the walls of the cabin like a struck bell. Marin waited it out. You will release my crew, she said when the sound faded. All of them unharmed with the Thessaly intact and her FTL drive reinstalled. You will return the cargo, yes, including the comm relays. And going forward, you will provide the Terran Intelligence Directorate with advance warning of any operations that target human vessels or human-aligned shipping in this sector. You want me to be your spy? I want you to be my friend. Friends share information. Friends look out for each other. Friends make sure that certain intelligence packages stay encrypted and certain clan secrets stay secret. And if I refuse, if I kill you now here in this room, then the package decrypts automatically in 72 hours. Dead man switch. My superiors will assume I've been killed and they'll release everything. Your clan dies. Slowly, violently, completely. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward. Or, and I genuinely think this is the better option, you and I shake on it, you drop me and my crew off at the nearest port, and the next time you're thinking about raiding a human vessel, you call me first and I tell you which ones are carrying things that'll get you killed. Everybody wins. Well, everybody except the Ilian, but they're not our friends. Voss stood motionless for a very long time. Marin could hear the Rithkai's systems humming around them, the pulse of alien engineering, the whisper of atmospheric processors calibrated for a body chemistry that would kill her in under an hour without the sealed environment of her human-rated corridor. She could hear her own heartbeat, steady and slow, and she could hear Voss's breathing, a rhythmic clicking in his thorax that sounded like a clock counting down. You planned this, he said. From the beginning, you allowed your ship to be captured. I facilitated your access to a vessel carrying cargo you couldn't resist, in a shipping lane where you were already operating, at a time when your security protocols would be most vulnerable to internal network penetration. Whether that constitutes allowing is a philosophical question. Your crew, your captain, they don't know. No. He thinks you're a traitor. He does. And you let him believe that. You let your own people despise you to maintain your cover. That's the job. Voss's eyes blinked in sequence, left to right to left again. The full processing cycle, the deepest level of Vekari cognitive engagement. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet and the translator almost didn't catch it. Humans terrify me. Marin stood up. She held out her hand, the human gesture of agreement, of contract, of trust offered across an unbridgeable gap between two beings who had no biological or cultural reason to trust each other. Her hand was small and soft and 5-fingered, and it looked absurd extended toward a creature whose forelimbs could crush reactor casing. Voss looked at her hand, he looked at her face. His mandibles worked silently around words that his translator couldn't render. Then one massive claw extended, and the tip of it, just the very point, sharp enough to score titanium, touched the center of her palm. The lightest possible contact, the smallest possible concession. Marin closed her fingers around the claw tip and squeezed once, gently. "I'll be in touch," she said. And then, because she was human, because humans are the species that cannot resist the small, mad gesture in the middle of the abyss, she reached up with her other hand and tapped the flat plate of his face, right between the second and third eye, with the tip of her index finger. A tap, quick and light and utterly inexplicable. Voss flinched. The most dangerous pirate in the outer territories, a being who had killed more sentient creatures than some plagues, flinched at a woman's fingertip touching his face. "What was that?" he said. "A human thing, you wouldn't understand." She turned and walked out of his quarters, through the Rithkai's angular corridors, back through the umbilical, and onto the Thessaly. Behind her, she heard Voss Ketharin issue a series of rapid clicks to his crew, orders that the translator rendered as garbled fragments, but that Marin's trained ear decoded clearly. "Stand down, release the prisoners, restore the ship." She walked back to the bridge. The two guards were still there, still confused by the false sensor readings that had since resolved themselves. They looked at her with the blank, multifaceted stare of beings who were not sure whether she was a prisoner, an asset, or something else entirely. Marin sat back down at the comm terminal and pulled up the ship's internal communication system. She opened a channel to the cargo bay. "Captain Rourke," she said, "this is Calloway. The Vekari are standing down. They're going to release us and return the ship. Please keep the crew calm and let the process happen without incident." There was a long silence. Then Rourke's voice, rough with pain and dried blood and something that might have been bewilderment. "Calloway, what the hell did you do?" "My job, sir." She closed the channel. Over the next 4 hours, the Vekari disengaged from the Thessaly with the same methodical precision they'd used to capture it, only in reverse. The boarding clamps released one by one, each one letting go with a deep, resonant clang that echoed through the hull like a funeral bell in reverse, like death unhappening. The FTL drive's control matrix was reinstalled, roughly, without finesse, but functionally. Tamaz watched the Vekari technicians work with his massive arms folded and his jaw clenched, every muscle in his body screaming to interfere, but he held. Everyone held. Rourke had given the order. Let them work, don't touch anything, don't speak, don't breathe wrong. The cargo was returned to its bays, every crate accounted for, including the 12 quantum-encrypted comm relays in Container 17. Dr. Liang moved through the crew checking injuries, the gash on Rourke's face, a dislocated shoulder on one of the engine techs, bruises and abrasions, and the invisible wounds that wouldn't show up for weeks, the ones that lived in the quiet hours before sleep, when the sound of clicking and the smell of copper and wet stone came back uninvited. The guards withdrew through the airlocks, and the umbilical sealed and separated, and the Rithkai uncoupled from the Thessaly's hull like a parasite pulling free. The moment the last clamp released, a shudder ran through the ship, not mechanical, but emotional, 24 people exhaling at the same time, a collective exhalation that fogged the air of the cargo bay like a small, shared prayer. Marin watched from the bridge viewport as the Vekari ship powered up its drives. Its angular hull caught the light of the nearest star and turned it into knife edges of reflection. It was, she had to admit, a beautiful ship. Brutal and purposeful and unapologetic in its design, the way a predator is beautiful not despite being dangerous, but because of it. Voss Ketharin's face appeared on the Thessaly's communication screen. His 4 eyes were unreadable. His mandibles were still. "Human," he said. "Captain, if you betray this arrangement, I will find you. Not your government, not your intelligence directorate, you, personally, and I will spend years making you regret it." "I know," Marin said. "That's why I picked you. You're the type who keeps their promises." The screen went dark. The Rithkai's drives flared, a burst of blue-white light that briefly turned the viewport into a window onto a star, and the ship was gone. Marin leaned back in her chair. The bridge was empty except for her. The rest of the crew was still in the cargo bay, being freed by bewildered Vekari guards who were trying to release humans who didn't want to be released because they didn't believe it was really happening. She could hear Rourke shouting something about demanding answers. She could hear Priya crying. She could hear the ship's life support system cycling back to normal parameters, the air growing cleaner and warmer, the Thessaly slowly remembering that it was a human vessel. She was tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones and makes your vision soft at the edges. She'd been awake for 31 hours, and she'd spent most of them performing the most dangerous piece of theater of her career while sitting in a chair and typing on a keyboard. She looked at her hands. They were shaking now, badly. The adrenaline crash was hitting, and her fingers trembled against the armrests of the chair like small animals trying to escape. She let them shake. There was no one watching. After a minute, she pulled up the comm terminal and composed a short, encrypted message on a frequency that the Thessaly's logs would never record. It was addressed to a receiving station that didn't officially exist, routed through a relay network that had been built specifically for communications that needed to never have happened. The message read, "Package delivered. Asset recruited, Thessaly intact, crew unaware, request extraction AT convenience. CALLOWAY." She sent it. Then she deleted the encryption protocols, wiped the routing data, and reset the comm terminal to its factory default state. By the time anyone looked at it, there would be nothing to find. Just a communications technician's workstation, used for nothing more interesting than unlocking cargo manifests and monitoring shipping frequencies. Marin stood, stretched, and walked to the cargo bay to rejoin her crew. She would need a story for what had happened. She would need to explain how she'd convinced an alien pirate captain to release them without a shot fired, without a ransom paid, without a single concession that anyone could see. She'd tell them she offered technical services, that she'd made herself so useful that Vas Ketharin decided she was worth more alive and free than dead or enslaved. That she'd convinced him that harming a Terran cargo crew would bring down more heat than the cargo was worth, that the cost-benefit analysis didn't favor killing when releasing was cheaper. A plausible lie, grounded in just enough truth to survive scrutiny. She'd rehearsed it in her head during the 4 hours of Vekari withdrawal, polishing the phrasing, testing it against the questions she knew Rourke would ask. The hardest part would be explaining why the Vekari had returned the cargo. Pirates didn't return cargo. It violated every incentive structure in the raiding economy. She'd need to sell the idea that Vas had calculated the military response to stolen comm relays versus stolen commodity chemicals, and decided the relays weren't worth the heat. It was thin. It would hold for exactly as long as it needed to, long enough for her to be transferred off the ship, and debriefed at a facility that no one on the Thessaly would ever know existed. Rourke would never believe it. He'd seen the look on her face when she walked past him on the cargo bay floor, and he'd spend the rest of his career wondering what had really happened on his ship. Priya would avoid her. The crew would whisper. Marin would be transferred off the Thessaly within a month, standard protocol, after a cover identity was compromised, even partially, and she would never see any of them again. That was the job. You carried the weight of the lie, and you carried it alone, and the people you protected never knew they'd been protected. They just knew that something had happened that didn't make sense, and that the woman who'd walked past the bleeding captain without looking down was somehow at the center of it. She reached the cargo bay door. She could hear Rourke inside, his voice hoarse and exhausted, trying to organize a crew that was equal parts relieved and terrified. She put her hand on the door release. She stopped. She was humming, a tune her mother used to sing in the kitchen on Sunday mornings back in Cordoba, when the light came through the window in long gold bars and the coffee was almost ready and the world was small and warm and human. She hadn't realized she was doing it. The melody had started somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where the things you don't think about live, and it had climbed up through her chest and into her throat without permission. She let it finish, one more bar too. Then she opened the door and stepped through, and the cargo bay was full of humans, her people, alive and angry and confused and beautiful in their stubborn, irrational, endlessly surprising aliveness. Rourke looked up. His left eye was swollen shut and his mouth was a thin line, and he looked at her the way you look at a stranger who has just done something you cannot explain or forgive. "Calloway," he said. "Captain, you have a lot of explaining to do." "Yes, sir, I do." She didn't, not to him, not to any of them. The explanation lived in encrypted files on a server that didn't exist, in a report that would be read by 4 people and then destroyed, in the memory of an alien pirate captain who was currently 3 light-years away and getting farther, nursing the sick knowledge that the small, soft, 5-fingered creatures he dismissed as cooperative prey had been playing a game he didn't know existed until he was already inside it. Somewhere in the void between stars, Vas Ketherin sat in his command quarters aboard the Rithkai and stared at the viewport and felt something he had never felt before in 200 years of raiding and killing and taking what was owed. He felt outmaneuvered. Not outgunned, not overpowered, not outrun, outmaneuvered. By a single human woman with no weapons, no armor, no claws, no venom, no exoskeleton, no biological advantage of any kind. A creature whose body was soft and whose bones broke easily and whose species had been traveling between stars for barely 2 centuries. She had walked into his quarters, alone and unarmed, and she had taken his entire world apart with a datapad and a smile. The worst part, the part that kept circling back no matter how many times he tried to think past it, was that she had enjoyed it. Not in the cruel way of a Vakari victor savoring a kill. Something different, something lighter. She had sat on his sleeping platform and crossed her legs and spoken to him the way you speak to someone you already know, someone you've been expecting to meet, and there had been a warmth in it that his tactical training had no framework for analyzing. She had been threatening to destroy his entire clan, and she had been warm about it. His species had a word for beings that were dangerous without anger. The closest English translation was something like weather, a force that did not hate you but would kill you all the same if you stood in the wrong place. Humans were weather. They were storms that smiled. He looked at his own reflection in the viewport. 4 eyes, expressionless, mandibles built for rending, a body evolved for dominance and predation over millions of years. The most dangerous physical specimen in any room he entered. And he had been defeated by a tap on the face. He reached up slowly and touched the spot between his second and third eye where her finger had landed. The chitin was smooth and cool, and it told him nothing. The gesture had no Vakari meaning. It was purely, irreducibly human, a piece of social vocabulary from a species that expressed things with their bodies that no translator could render and no tactical analysis could anticipate. She had touched his face. In the middle of blackmailing him into submission, she had paused to touch his face. Not a threat, not a dominance display, not a mark of ownership or a warning or a signal of any kind that his species recognized. Just a tap, playful, almost affectionate. It was the most unsettling thing that had ever been done to him. He sat there for a long time, in the amber light of his quarters, while the Rithkai carried him deeper into the void and farther from the small, wounded ship that he had captured, and then lost in a way that no pirate ballad would ever adequately describe. He thought about the woman, about the way she had sat on his sleeping platform and crossed her legs and smiled at him while dismantling his entire operation. About the steadiness of her hands and the calm in her voice, and the tune she'd been humming under her breath as she left. A melody he couldn't identify, from a culture he'd never bothered to understand. carrying emotional information that his 4 eyes and his translator and his 200 years of experience could not begin to decode. He opened a communication channel, encrypted, private, routed through 3 relay points. The message went not to his own syndicate, not to his Ilian contacts. It went to the Vekari Territorial Council, the governing body of the clans, the authority that held the power to sanction or destroy any syndicate operating in Vekari space. It was the closest thing his species had to an emergency frequency, and in 200 years, Vas Ketharin had never used it. The message was short, stripped of context, stripped of detail, stripped of everything except the raw, unvarnished plea of a predator who had just learned that he was not the most dangerous thing in the forest. It translated roughly as, "I need help." 4 words, the Vekari equivalent of begging, a sound that Vas Ketharin had never made, and that every pirate captain in the outer territories would have bet their scarification he never would. But they hadn't met Marin Calloway. They hadn't felt the tap. Back on the Thessaly, Marin sat in the mess hall with a cup of real coffee, the good stuff, from the captain's private supply, which Rourke had grudgingly offered after she'd given her carefully constructed cover story to the assembled crew. The coffee was hot and bitter, and it tasted like civilization. She held the cup with both hands because her fingers were still shaking, and she blew on the surface and watched the steam curl up into the recycled air and thought about nothing in particular. That wasn't true. She was thinking about the names on the Aventine passenger manifest. The children, 4 to 11 years old. She was thinking about whether any of them were still alive somewhere in the Dreeketh slave markets, and whether the intelligence package she'd sent would eventually lead to operations that found them. She was thinking about the fact that she had sat across from the man responsible for those children's abduction and called him friend, and tapped him on the face like they were old drinking buddies, and she was thinking about how that had been the right thing to do, the strategically correct decision, the move that saved 24 lives today and might save thousands tomorrow, and she was thinking about how knowing something is right doesn't always make it feel clean. The coffee helped, small things helped, the weight of a ceramic cup, the bitter smell. The warmth spreading through fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. These were the anchors that kept you human when the job asked you to be something else. Priya sat down across from her. The navigator's eyes were red-rimmed, and her jaw was set, and she looked at Marin with an expression that was trying very hard to be hostile but couldn't quite get there. "I called you a traitor," Priya said. "I heard." "Were you?" Marin took a sip of coffee. "I was whatever I needed to be to get us out alive." Priya stared at her for a long time. Then she reached across the table and put her hand on Marin's wrist, the human gesture of connection, of forgiveness, of the small warmths that bind a species together across all the gaps that logic and evolution and the cold vacuum of space put between them. "Thank you," Priya said. Marin looked at the hand on her wrist, small and warm and 5-fingered. The most powerful weapon in the galaxy, and the aliens would never figure out why. "You're welcome," she said. And she drank her coffee, and the Thessaly limped toward port, and somewhere in the dark between the stars, the most feared pirate captain in the outer territories was on his knees for the first time in 200 years, begging the galaxy for rescue from something he couldn't fight and couldn't shoot and couldn't outrun. A human touch. The kind that stays with you.